Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I are here to talk about one of Roger's favorite things, horror. So recently, on this dumb channel, there have been some changes made about how I do some things. A lot of my reading projects that I've had going on have been, decommissioned. But I'm still going to read all of that stuff, and I've kind of reverted to a system, although calling it a system it's not really a system, but this is this thing I used to do a long time ago before I ever got on BookTube, where I would have a shelf, and I would just put stacks of books on the shelf, and it was my, the books I'm going to read shelf. Sort of a TBR shelf, but at the time I did this, I didn't know what a TBR was. It was an unknown term to me at one time. Anyway, I would have this shelf, and I'd put a stack of science fiction, I'd put a stack of horror, I'd put a stack of something else, detective novels or whatever. And every time I finished reading a book, I would go to this shelf and just, if I felt like reading a horror novel or something, or horror book, I'd just pick one off the top and read it. Same thing with science fiction or whatever. And I've kind of done that again. I have a shelf over there, and I've got stacks of books on it. Horror, science fiction, Edgar Rice Burroughs, because I'm reading through Edgar Rice Burroughs books. I've got Stephen King over there, and I've got Westerns, and I've got a stack of just random stuff that doesn't really fit in with those other categories. And now, if there's not a reading event going on and I'm not committed to some reading event thing, and if I just feel like reading a horror novel, I'll just pick one up off the top. And so I thought, you know what? I'll make a video about anything. So I will take that stack over here and I'll show you what's on my stack of horror. And if you're interested, I'll show you later what's on the stack of science fiction and all that other jazz. It's up, if you feel like seeing that kind of thing. Anyway, I brought the horror over. And it's a stack of 15 books. It didn't mean for it to be 15, but it ends up it's 15 books. And let's see. Roger, everybody's just dying to see. They're just dying to see what 15 books are on the stack of horror books I'm going to read next. When I say next, they're the next horror books I'll read. That could be at any time. Who knows? Anyway, those 15 books in the stack of horror, what are they? The first one is this one. This is my favorite horror story. My favorite horror story, which was a cool anthology from the year 2000. The year 2000, remember that? It seems like such a long time ago now. It was the future at one time. Anyway, the year 2000, this book came out. My favorite horror story, which is a book where popular horror writers will choose their favorite horror story. And those horror stories make up this anthology. And the popular horror writers who were choosing stories in this were, we got Stephen King, we've got Ed Gorman. Does anybody remember Ed Gorman anymore? I don't know. F. Paul Wilson, Ramsey Campbell, Peter Atkins, Richard Lehman. Richard Lehman has good taste. He chose The Color Out of Space, so, he did a good job. Peter Straub, Rick Hautala, Michael Slade, Richard Christian Matheson, Joe R. Lansdale, Poppy Z. Bright, Joyce Carol Oates, Dennis Etchison, and Harlan Ellison. So those were the horror writers, although Harlan Ellison, he wrote all kinds of stuff. And so does Joyce Carol Oates. But they are the writers who chose their favorite horror stories. And so we got a lot of cool stuff. We've got Lovecraft is in here more than once, Robert Bloch, Ramsey Campbell. Ramsey Campbell has a story chosen and is one of the choosers. So, you know, that's a nice distinction. Philip K. Dick, this is a really cool anthology. So, yeah, it's at the top of the stack. I'm going to read this one, you know, when I have an opportunity. When Sumerian September is over, I will grab this off the top and read this, my favorite horror story, and I'll talk more about it on one of my weekend reading reports. But yeah, it's a cool book, my favorite horror story. That was the one on the top. Next, this is a very tottering stack. I put a stack on another stack, so it's very tall. Hopefully there'll be no disasters. You could say everything that happens on this channel is a disaster. That wouldn't be inaccurate. Anyway, the next book is one that was left over from Garbogust. I'm not going to have time to read this for Garbogust, but it is such a Garbogusty book. It is a paperback from hell, obviously. It's from the 80s. It's from the paperback from hell era. And it is so paperback from hell that I have to read it. John Ferris's Son of the Endless Night. I mean, it's got the creepy kid. It's got the step back cover with the demon. Who cares what it's even about? I mean, it's got that stuff going on. Although it's kind of long, man. There's a lot of stuff going on in this book. It's 500 pages of whatever is happening in this book. The millennium approaches. Uh-oh. You gotta watch out when that millennium gets here. Whew. The Philadelphia Inquirer says, a nightmare that can take the paint right off your walls. What the fuck? It'll take the paint off your walls? I guess that could be useful. So this could be a useful horror novel, according to the Philadelphia Inquirer. That was an... Anyway, Son of the Endless Night by John Ferris. That's on there. Of course it is. Next. So when I was going through a bunch of books the other day, I found this book, which I haven't seen in forever, and of course I want to read it, which is Charles Beaumont's Night Ride and Other Journeys. This was from when? 1960, I think this came out? Let me see. When did this book come out? Was it 1960? I think it was. Yeah. Published March 1960. So Charles Beaumont was a wonderful writer. He was a wonderful writer who was one of the writers that was hired to do scripts for The Twilight Zone. So, along with Richard Matheson, Charles Beaumont wrote some of the more memorable Twilight Zone episodes, and he was really the perfect writer to do The Twilight Zone. And so that is probably where he is best remembered. What? It's just a dog. It's just a dog, Rhonda. Shh. Where was I? Oh yes, I was talking about Charles Beaumont and his book Night Ride and Other Journeys. So anyway, Charles Beaumont was wonderful, and he died far too young and didn't leave us with enough wonderful stories, but he did leave us with some great ones, and you could find some of those in Night Ride and Other Journeys. It has this great cover on it, and it has some of his better known stories, I think, in this one. Yeah, it's got the Howling Man. The Howling Man became a Twilight Zone episode, so that was really cool. And Perchance to Dream, it's got that one. That was another Twilight Zone episode. And a bunch of stories that weren't Twilight Zone episodes, but probably could have been. Excellent writer. And so, yeah, Night Ride and Other Journeys. This one's going to be really cool. So, yeah, there's that. What else did I get? Oh, yeah, this one's weird. Fiends. Fiends and Other Creatures. Fiends and Other Creatures. This is edited by Marvin Kaye. So this is an anthology of stories with writers like Ray Bradbury, Lord Dunsany. Tennessee Williams is in this. Robert Bloch, Fritz Leiber, and M.R. James. They're all in there. So it looks to be a pretty cool little collection. It's not terribly long, 190 pages. But yeah, there's some good writers in here. Charles Dickens is in here with Captain Murderer. This is a highfalutin anthology. And yeah, Eugene D. Goodwin, and some writers I've never heard of. So yeah, Fiends and Creatures. It looked cool. You know, it's odd. This is from Popular Library, and it's labeled as science fiction, even though it's totally not science fiction. It is, you know, full of superlative spellbinders, the greatest tales of terror of all time. I think that might be going a little far, but obviously an anthology of horror stories, Fiends and Creatures, but, you know, science fiction according to Popular Library. But yeah, that one looks cool. Then there's this one. Now, I just read a book by this guy that I thought was really good. He wrote The Rats. It's James Herbert, and this is The Dark. The Dark. Now, I also read The Fog by James Herbert, and I've heard that this is kind of like that. But it seems to be totally different, because in The Fog, there was this fog that drove people insane. If you went into the fog, you went insane. Where in this one, it's like darkness, and if you get into this darkness, whatever it is, then you'll go insane. So it seems totally different. Yeah, Icy Tendrils of Blackness. The Dark. So there could be something more to it than that. We will see. The Dark by James Herbert. It looks really cool. I'm going to read this. I mean, I figure even if it's not the best James Herbert novel, you know, it's probably pretty good, because he seems to be a pretty good writer. I've read 2 books by him, and they've both been good, so we'll see. The Dark by James Herbert. There's that one. And I'm finally getting to this book, which I've had for 100 years. Or I will finally get to it. It's on the stack of books to get to. And that is Alone with the Horrors by Ramsey Campbell. Alone with the Horrors. This is the original Arkham House edition of this book. There was a later edition of this, and I think the contents changed a bit. But this was the original one. And when was this original one published? Let me see. This was published in 1993. Published in 1993, and it's got photo montage interiors by J.K. Potter. And the title page is pretty cool. They've got Campbell there. And yeah, it's full of some really interesting photo montage artwork. Cutting edge stuff from the early 90s. And this is supposed to be what Ramsey Campbell thought was Ramsey Campbell's best stories. The great short fiction of Ramsey Campbell, 1961 through 1991. So that's pretty cool. I like Ramsey Campbell a lot, so I'm looking forward to getting to this finally. Now, this is an author that I've really been meaning to get to, and I've decided I'm going to start with his first book. I believe this is his first book. Let me know if I'm wrong. This was sent to me by the wonderful Juan from Plagued by Visions, a great booktube channel and a wonderful guy. This is Jack Ketchum's Off Season. Jack Ketchum's Off Season, which I think has something to do with creepy cannibals, but I could be wrong. But, you know, it's Off Season, Jeff Ketchum, or Jack Ketchum. Jeff Ketchum. It's Jack Ketchum. I can read. Barely. So yeah, Jack Ketchum's Off Season. And according to Stephen King, if you read Off Season on Thanksgiving, you probably won't sleep until Christmas. Stephen King, he is pretty good at blurbs, you know. He's had a lot of practice, I guess. So yeah, Off Season by Jack Ketchum. Now this is a book that was very kindly sent to me probably under the assumption that I would actually read it, and then I didn't. Who sent me this book? This was sent to me by Weird House. It's Weird House who sent this book to me. I don't know how Weird House got my address, but they did, and they sent me this book, which I never read, but I probably should get to it. This is The Howling Terror and Other Lovecraftian Horror Stories, written by Tony Richards. And I've had this one for a while. But it's really nice, actually. It's a really nice hardcover book. Fancy pants and papers there. And it's illustrated, right? Yeah, it's got some cool illustrations. It's signed, I think. Isn't this book signed? Let me see, yeah. Limited to 100 signed and numbered hardcovers. So I wonder if this is available in paperback at all. I don't know. I don't know how they do their stuff, Weird House. But they did send me this book, and so I ought to read it. I do like Lovecraftian horror stories an awful lot, and this one looks pretty cool. So yeah, I will read this. It's on the stack of books to read. I'll get to it at some point. So, this next one is the best new horror. The best new horror #1. It's not the best new horror anymore. But at one time it was, I suppose. This is the 25th anniversary edition. This is actually the best new horror from 1989. I think it was 1989, right? Almost certainly it was. Yeah, 1989 is when this was first published. And this is the 25th anniversary edition. This is edited by Stephen Jones and Ramsey Campbell. And a really cool looking horror anthology. This was a long-running series, I think. I don't know. I think I used to see these around with different covers on them. But this, like I said, it's the 25th anniversary edition. And there's a bunch of cool people in here that used to write stories back in 1989, like Robert McCammon, and Ramsey Campbell has a story in here. Kim Newman has a story in here. Kim Newman, Anno Dracula's Kim Newman. And who else is in here? A bunch of people I've never heard of. And Thomas Ligotti is in here. And Carl Edward Wagner's in here. Richard Lehman is in here. So this should be cool. Yeah, best new horror. It's in that stack of books I need to get to. Oh, this is another book that was sent to me by the publisher that I never read because I'm the worst booktuber ever. This is Black City Skyline by Black City Skyline and Darker Horizons by Barry Lee DeJezu. I can't pronounce any names, and I've never read anything by Barry Lee DeJezu. This forward, though, is by T.E.D. Klein, which I know is a really good writer. He wrote almost nothing. He wrote some stories and a novel, and we've been waiting forever for him to write more. But he did write the introduction to this book, Black City Skyline and Darker Horizons, which is a collection of horror. And it was published by Hippocampus Press, and like I said, they sent it to me. Don't know how Hippocampus Press got my address, but they did, and they sent me this book. So I must have given it to somebody who gave it to Hippocampus Press. That's really cool. Anyway, gonna read this, and I will tell all of you how it is after I have read it. Dark City Skyline from Hippocampus Press. This next one is a really old book. This is The Devil's Generation. The Devil's Generation, edited by Vic Gedalia. 9 Visits to the Dark Side of Destiny. 9 Horrors by the best science fantasy writers of all time. So, this is from Lancer Books. And who are these science fantasy writers who are writing horror? Ray Bradbury, Henry Kuttner, Richard Matheson. Okay, we've got some good ones here. Robert Bloch, August Derleth, Robert Silverberg, Anthony Boucher, Clifford D. Samac, and Algernon Blackwood. So that is a good lineup of writers writing stories. So The Devil's Generation. Now, when was this published? I want to say it was the mid-70s at some point. When was it? 1973. Okay, so it's this old book from 1973, The Devil's Generation. That looks pretty cool. Going to get to that. I mean, that's an all-star lineup. So I look forward to that. And speaking of old-timey horror anthologies, every time I see a book like this, you know, or at least when I was still actively buying books for myself, anytime I'd see a book like this, I would always like to pick it up. And they're just old horror anthologies from the year's best horror stories. And this is the year's best horror stories. Is this volume 5? I'm not good with my Roman numerals. It's series V, which I think is 5. So yeah, the year's best horror stories, series 5. Edited by Gerald W. Page. I think this is the series of books that Karl Edward Wagner later on took over for being the editor of. I'm not sure though. I don't know. It's been a while. But this is the year's best horror stories from Daw. This one is edited by Gerald W. Page. And what year was it? So this came out in 77. But it looks like most of the stories are from 76. So yeah, that makes sense. They were doing the previous year's stories. We've got David Drake is in here. Robert Edmund Alter. C.L. Grant. Fritz Leiber is in here. Manly Wade Wellman. So this one has a lot of cool writers as well. And Karl Edward Wagner is in this volume. So that's cool. Looks like Robert Bloch has a couple stories in here. Harlan Ellison is in here. So that's cool. These old anthologies are really great because, you know, sometimes you'll pick these up and you'll find stories in them that haven't been reprinted since, you know. Even if they were the best, you know, they might have been forgotten since then, or they might be hard to find nowadays. And these horror stories are probably worth reading. Usually they are if they're from a series like this. So yeah, I got this one on this deck to read. This next one is pretty cool. This is a pretty cool old paperback. This is Between Time and Terror. Between Time and Terror. And what I think this is it's a science fiction horror anthology. So science fiction horror. And this came out, what, in 91, 92? When was it? Actually, it's 95. So later than I thought. It's from 95. And so it's from 1995 and it has a bunch of horror stories that are also science fiction. And you can see on the cover there, we've got a lot of great authors. Dean Koontz. But remember, this was Dean Koontz back when he had a mustache and a receding hairline. That was the good Dean Koontz who wrote entertaining stories and books. So Dean Koontz from, you know, the olden days. Isaac Asimov is in here. Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein, Clive Barker is in here. And I think the whole thing starts off with H.P. Lovecraft. It does. And Frank Belknap Long is in here too. And Clark Ashton Smith. And John W. Campbell Jr. is in here. So there's some good writers in here. Yeah, Robert Bloch is in this one. F. Paul Wilson. John Shirley. Dan Simmons is in this book. So yeah, Between Time and Terror. A cool old paperback book from 1995. That's pretty cool. I'm looking forward to that. Then, a couple more left, just a couple. I've had this for a little while now. This is, and just haven't read it. This is Cold Skin by Albert Sanchez Pinal. Cold Skin. Now, I know this novel was made into a film, which I think is on Shudder. Shudder, the horror film streaming service. I think it's like a Shudder film or something. Anyway, I know they made it into a movie that I have not watched because I never watch television anymore. I pay for all of these streaming services. I never watch them. I never watch them. I'm too busy reading. So Cold Skin, which is supposed to be pretty good. It's like kind of a Lovecraftian horror thing, I think. I don't really know what it's about. Well, I know it's about monsters of some sort. Cold Skin, there you go. Monsters with cold skin, that's what it's about. Obviously that's what it's about. But it's supposed to be pretty good. So, yeah. Got this. Now this next one, I have read this book, but I only read this book once. And when did this book come out? You've got to say, right? When this book came out? This book came out in, I know it was the 80s, but this is a reprint. And, oh yeah, here it is. First published in 1984. So I read this book probably in 1985 or 1986. So I was about, 14 or 15 years old when I read this. And I was really impressed. And it introduced me to this author who I mentioned a moment ago. And that is T.E.D. Klein. And the book is The Ceremonies, which is, as far as I know, the only novel that T.E.D. Klein ever wrote. He wrote some other novellas, or novelettes, or whatever you want to call them. Long short stories. He wrote about 5 or 6 of those that I'm aware of. But I think this is still the only novel that he's written. I mean, he's still around. I guess he could still finish writing something. But he's kind of legendary because he had such a tiny output of fiction and the quality of it was just so high. This is a really good writer. I don't, however, remember much about this novel. I know it is based on one of those long short stories that he wrote, Events at Perothe Farm, I think it was the original title. And he took that basic story and he expanded it quite a bit into this novel. This novel is not short. How long is this thing? Yeah, it's 600 pages. But I remember it being really good. I remember it being pretty riveting, actually. But, it's been a while since I was 15. It's been a year or two. So it's been a long time since I've read this. So when I was going through books to put on the shelf, this one stood out. And I said, yeah, I've got to revisit this book. It is long past time, especially since I don't really remember much. Aside from the basic situation, I don't remember much about the novel. The story I remember really well, but the novel, not so much. So there you go. One minor interruption by my terrible dog, Rhonda, who again didn't want to be on camera. But yeah, there you go. My 15 books, my 15 horror books that are on my shelf. And I will probably make another one of these eventually when I don't have any other videos to do about some of the science fiction books or whatever I've got sitting over there. If you want to watch it, let me know. Let me know. Anyway, I guess that's all we have to say today, Roger. I will catch you next time.